Miles Braxton stepped out of his matte black Range Rover, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel of the quiet driveway. The air smelled like rain and cedar, the kind of scent that made you stop and breathe a little deeper. The farmhouse in front of him looked forgotten by time, peeling white paint, a wraparound porch sagging with age, but Miles could see something more beneath the wear. Opportunity, foundation, maybe even peace. From the passenger seat, a burst of laughter erupted. "Dad, do you think there are treasure maps in there?" asked Noah, his 7-year-old son, practically leaping from the SUV. The boy's energy was boundless, his sneakers already kicking through leaves before Miles could answer. "Maybe not maps," Miles said, adjusting his tailored coat with a smile. "But I've got a feeling there's something valuable on this land." They'd only just arrived in the small town of Windermere, a last-minute decision, like most of Miles's moves since the accident. But when Celeste Whitaker had called him with an offer, renovate an old barn on a piece of land miles from anywhere, he hadn't hesitated. He needed the distance. Noah needed the calm. "Before we go any further, tell me, how far has this story reached you? Drop your city in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from right now?" He hadn't expected her to be waiting for him. She leaned against the barn, arms crossed, blonde hair tied in a low ponytail, flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, jeans dusty at the knees. She was stunning in a way that wasn't loud. Elegance without effort. Celeste watched the barn like it might fall over if she blinked too long. "You must be Miles Braxton," she said as he approached. He offered his hand. "And you're Celeste Whitaker." "Appreciate you coming out so quick," she said, shaking it. "This old thing's barely holding together." He eyed the barn. "I've seen worse, but yeah, she's got some stories in her walls." "You fix things without asking too many questions, right?" Miles gave a sideways grin. "Depends on who's asking," she smirked back. "I don't mind a man with boundaries." Inside, the barn smelled like dust and memory. Sunlight poked through broken slats in the roof, casting gold across the hay-strewn floor. Miles ran a hand over one of the beams, knocking it twice. Solid. "The structure's intact," he said. "Roof needs bracing. These boards won't survive winter, though." Celeste nodded. "I'll help where I can. You swing a hammer, I swing what needs swinging." Miles let out a short laugh. Not many landowners get their hands dirty. "I don't like watching." He respected that. Watching people sit back while others did the work was something he'd had enough of in boardrooms and broken homes. This woman, this place, was already different. As they walked back outside, Noah was crouched under the porch steps, coaxing a stray dog from the shadows. The dog, scrappy and rust-colored, wagged its tail like it had been waiting for them. "Can we keep him?" Noah asked, eyes lit up. Miles hesitated. Celeste smiled. "That's Scout. Showed up last winter, never left. Seems like he's been waiting for someone." Noah's fingers dug into the dog's fur, as if letting go would be a crime. Scout leaned into the boy like they belonged to each other already. "Guess we've got a dog now," Miles said softly. The sun was dipping low, casting amber across the open fields behind the barn. Miles stood still for a moment, watching the light shift across the hills. Something about this place made his chest ache in a way that felt right. Maybe Windermere wasn't just a job. Maybe, just maybe, it was a beginning. Celeste glanced sideways at him. "I make a mean apple pie," she said casually. "You and Noah around this weekend?" Miles caught her gaze, and something passed between them, something unspoken but loud all the same. "We'd like that." He helped Noah into the backseat, Scout already curled up on the floor. As he pulled out of the driveway, he checked the rearview mirror one last time. Celeste stood there, hands in her pockets, the barn behind her, the wind in her hair, watching, waiting. And for the first time in years, he felt like someone was waiting for him to come back. The morning sun rose slow and golden over Windermere, pulling a thin mist off the fields as Miles Braxton tightened the final bolt on a fresh support beam inside the barn. The sound of his hammer striking wood echoed softly, rhythmic and sure, like the heartbeat of something coming back to life. The barn might have been worn out and forgotten, but under his hands it was beginning to breathe again. He moved with ease, sleeves rolled, forearms streaked with dust, every movement deliberate. Years of working with his hands, even after building empires and making headlines, had taught him something the business world hadn't. Structure begins with foundation. And this barn had one worth saving. The crunch of boots on gravel behind him broke his focus. Celeste Whitaker stepped into the barn, holding a battered thermos and 2 cups. She didn't say anything at first, just handed him a cup, her eyes scanning the progress like it mattered. Her, and he could tell it did. Coffee, she offered, tone casual. He took a sip. Strong, dark, no nonsense. You don't strike me as the weak coffee type, he said. She raised a brow. I don't do anything weak. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that settled in easy. Miles noticed the way her gaze lingered on the beams, not just inspecting the repairs, but remembering. He could tell. She wasn't just preserving a structure, she was preserving something personal. This barn must mean a lot to you, he said, watching her face. It's been in my family for generations, she replied, voice low, eyes distant. My grandfather built it with his own hands. My parents kept it alive. I learned to ride in the field out back before I could even ride a bike. She paused, her jaw tightening slightly. Now it's just me. He didn't ask for more. He knew the shape of loss and the silence that followed it. Instead, he set his cup down and picked up his hammer again. Well, he said, nodding toward the barn walls, she's still got good bones. She'll stand tall again, Celeste offered. A small smile, quiet, grateful. They worked side by side, her holding boards in place while he secured them, passing tools and measuring planks. She was quick to learn, focused, never wasting movement or words. She didn't talk about her family much, but Miles could feel the weight of it all in how hard she worked to keep this place from slipping away. By mid-morning, Noah showed up with Scout trotting beside him like a tiny, shaggy shadow. The dog barked once, then went sniffing around the edges of the barn like he was inspecting the job site. Scouts are quality control, Noah declared, and I'm management. Management? Huh? Celeste asked, amused. Yep, the boy said, arms crossed seriously. Dad builds. I make sure nobody slacks off. Miles laughed. Guess I better watch myself then. The boy wandered the barn, asking about each tool, tapping on planks, curious about every part of the job. Will it be new when it's done? He asked, tracing a finger along the fresh wood. No, Miles said, but it'll be strong. Some things aren't supposed to be replaced, just made stronger. Celeste met his gaze. There was something in his voice, something just under the surface that made her look at him a second longer than she meant to. Miles had picked up whispers in town, small conversations at the local diner, a passing remark at the feed store. People talked that the Whitaker family had once owned more land than anyone in Windermere, that Celeste's father was a visionary who'd built a small fortune from the soil. But after his death, things changed. She inherited everything but rejected. The pressure to sell. Corporate developers had come knocking. She never answered. He respected that. In a world where everything had a price, Celeste had drawn a line. Later that afternoon, the wind shifted. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, casting long shadows across the golden fields. Celeste glanced up. Storm's coming. Miles nodded. We should wrap. This old roof won't handle much. Noah groaned. But we just got started. The barn will still be here tomorrow, Celeste said gently. As Miles secured their tools, Celeste stood quietly by the porch. She looked like she was going to say something, then didn't, but just before he climbed into the truck, she spoke. You and Noah should come by for dinner sometime, she said. It's been a while since this house had company. Miles met her eyes. There was no angle in her voice, no hesitation, just truth. We'd like that. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Miles felt it again, quiet, subtle, undeniable, like gravity, like roots starting to take hold. Rain drummed gently on the roof of the small rental house, tapping out a rhythm that echoed through the quiet kitchen. Miles Braxton stood by the window, cradling a mug of black coffee as he watched the grey morning wrap itself around Windermere. The world outside looked blurred, like someone had taken a watercolor brush to the town and smeared the lines. At the kitchen table, Noah was swinging his legs, full of chatter and half-eaten pancakes. "Do you think Scout likes syrup?" the boy asked, dropping a crumb to the floor. Scout didn't hesitate. He lunged, tail wagging wildly as he devoured it. Miles shook his head with a sigh. "You're going to spoil that dog." Noah grinned. "He's worth it." Maybe he was. Since they'd arrived, Noah had been lighter, freer. He laughed more, slept better, and for the first time in a long time, Miles felt like maybe, just maybe, he was doing something right. That night they were expected at the Whitaker farmhouse. Dinner, an honest-to-God invitation to sit at a table with real food, real company. Miles tried not to think about the last time that had happened. By the time the sun started to drop behind, the hills, the storm had passed. The gravel road to Celeste's property glistened under fading light. The house stood proud and weathered, its porch light glowing warm against the blue-grey sky. Celeste met them at the door, with flour on her cheek and sleeves rolled high. There was a looseness in her smile tonight, something softer, like the storm, had rinsed away a little of her guarded edge. "Perfect timing," she said, stepping aside. "Dinner's almost ready." Noah looked hopeful. "Did you make pancakes?" Celeste blinked, then laughed. "Not quite, but you'll survive." Inside, the house smelled like warmth, roasted herbs, fresh bread, a hint of something sweet baking low in the oven. The space was lived in, lined with framed photographs, shelves crowded with books and half-used candles. A fire crackled in, the hearth casting gold light across the worn wooden floor. Dinner was simple but perfect, slow-cooked stew, warm biscuits, and conversation that flowed easy. Noah ate like he hadn't tasted real food in months. "This is way better than pancakes," he mumbled with a mouthful of biscuit. "I'll take that as a win," Celeste said. Miles let his gaze wander around the room, taking in the history, etched into the walls. "This place feels like it remembers." Celeste followed his eyes, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she pointed to an old black-and-white photo on the mantel. "That's my father," she said. "Elijah Whitaker." Miles watched her closely as she spoke. Her voice didn't waver, but her fingers tapped softly against the table's edge. A nervous rhythm, a memory surfacing. He built this farm into something more than just fields. He had a vision. He wanted it to mean something. "Doesn't seem like that vision's gone," Miles said quietly. Celeste gave a faint smile, but said nothing more. Noah, unbothered by the weight in the room, asked, "Is he still here?" "No," she replied gently. "He passed a few years ago." "Oh," the boy said softly. "Sorry." "Thank you, Noah." After dinner while Noah and Scout tore around the yard like small tornadoes, Miles joined Celeste on the porch. They stood side by side, watching the stars blink into view, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. "I appreciate the invitation," Miles said eventually. "It's been a long time since we had a real meal like that." Celeste leaned on the railing, her eyes somewhere out in the darkness. "It's been a long time since this house had company." There was a pause, quiet, full of things unsaid. "You don't talk much about your past," she noted. "Not much to talk about," he replied. "That's not true." He didn't argue. Instead, he exhaled slowly. "Noah's mom passed when he was 3. Car accident. We were supposed to meet for lunch that day. I was late. It was raining." Celeste didn't rush to respond. She just looked at him, open and steady. "I'm sorry," he nodded. "Me too." "You've done a good job with him," she added. "He's a remarkable kid." Miles smiled softly. "Yeah, he is." Silence fell again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt like understanding, like ground being cleared for something new. Celeste looked up at the sky and spoke so quietly he almost missed it. "Sometimes things don't go the way we planned, but that doesn't mean they can't still be good." Miles turned toward her, really seeing her now. Not just the strong, guarded woman who'd stood alone against pressure and change, but the one who still believed in something better, and maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe in it too. Thus, late afternoon sun spilled gold across the rolling fields of Windermere as Miles Braxton steered his truck down the familiar gravel road toward the Whitaker farm. Noah sat in the passenger seat, one arm draped protectively around Scout, who had claimed his lap as personal territory. Things had shifted since that dinner at the farmhouse. Nothing dramatic, no sudden declarations or drawn lines. But there was a difference. In the way Celeste looked at him now, in the way she lingered when their hands brushed, in the way Noah called the farm ours without even thinking about it. That morning, Celeste had invited them back, not for a meal, but for something simpler, something softer. Planting. Miles had never planted anything in his life. Built. Skyscrapers? Yes. Closed multi-million-dollar deals. Definitely, but putting seeds into dirt, that was new territory. "You ever planted anything before?" he asked, eyeing Noah with a smirk as the boys stared out the window. Noah shook his head. "Nope, but Miss Celeste said it's easy. Just dig a hole, drop the seed, and wait." Miles chuckled. "It's not just about dropping the seed. You've got to water it, check the soil, make sure it gets sun. It's not magic, it's patience." Noah tilted his head. "Like fixing the barn?" That stopped Miles for a beat. He looked at his son. "Yeah, like fixing the barn." Celeste was waiting near the garden, kneeling in the soil, a wooden crate filled with seed packets beside her. She looked natural there, the afternoon light catching in her blonde hair, streaks of dirt on her jeans. If she was nervous, she didn't. "Show it. I hope you're ready to get your hands dirty," she said as they stepped out of the truck. Noah beamed. "Totally ready." She handed him a small trowel and a pair of gloves. "We're planting wildflowers. This patch has been bare too long." As she guided Noah through the process, how deep to dig, how to space the seeds, Miles stood back, watching. There was something sacred about it. The way she spoke to the land. The way the land seemed to answer her in silence. After a few minutes, he crouched beside them, rolling up his sleeves. "You've done this since you were a kid?" he asked. Celeste nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "My mom used to say planting was like putting hope in the ground. She said it was faith in things you couldn't see yet." There was weight in her voice again, the kind Miles had come to recognize, the tone people used when speaking of people they loved and lost. "She passed when I was 17, Celeste added after a moment. "Cancer, quick, cruel!" Miles didn't offer condolences. Instead, he nodded slowly. He understood what grief sounded like when it stopped asking for attention and just quietly sat in your bones. For a while they worked in silence. Noah hummed to himself as he pressed the soil over the seeds. "It's kinda like magic," he said, not looking up. "You can't see anything, but it's happening anyway." Celeste smiled. "Exactly." They were nearly done when the sound of tires crunching on gravel interrupted the peace. Celeste's posture stiffened instantly. Miles turned just as a black sedan came into view, its polished exterior jarring against the rustic backdrop. A man stepped out, sharp suit, polished shoes, and the kind of smirk Miles had seen too many times in corporate boardrooms, the kind that said he was used to getting what he wanted. Celeste stood, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Stay here," she told Miles under her breath. He watched her approach the man. She moved like someone who'd had this conversation before and didn't want to have it again. "You've been ignoring my calls." the man said. There was nothing left to say, Celeste replied, her voice cool. Come on, the man scoffed. This place is sitting on a gold mine. You could walk away from all this, clean. Miles couldn't hear the rest, but he didn't need to. He could read it in Celeste's body language, the tightness in her shoulders, the way her arms crossed like armor. He stood and made his way over, slow but deliberate. Everything okay? He asked, keeping his tone even. The man looked at him, expression amused. And you are? Someone who doesn't like watching people get cornered, Miles said, his voice low but firm. The man's smirk faded slightly. Think about it, Celeste, he said, before it's too late. And just like that, he turned and drove off, his tires kicking dust into the late afternoon air. Celeste let out a breath she'd been holding for too long. Miles didn't press. Instead, he stood beside her, watching the road where the car had disappeared. Who was that? He asked finally. Victor Langston, she said quietly. He used to work with my father. Now he thinks he owns the legacy. Miles didn't answer right away. He just looked out over the land, then back at her. You're not alone in this, he said. Celeste turned to him, surprised. For a woman used to carrying everything on her own, those words landed hard, and for the first time she nodded. Not out of politeness, but because she wanted to believe it was true. The next morning arrived on a gust of cold wind, rustling through the trees and sending early leaves skittering across the ground. The storm had passed, but its presence still hung in the air like a warning. The fields around the Whitaker farm shimmered with moisture, the soil soaked and fragrant, the sky washed pale and soft. Miles Braxton stood by the busted north fence, hands on his hips, surveying the damage. Wooden posts lay cracked in the mud, wire fencing curled like twisted vines. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was bad enough. Behind him, boots crunched over damp grass. Celeste Whitaker approached with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to him without a word and joined him in the silence, both of them staring out over the broken line that once held everything together. Not as bad as it could have been, Miles said after a moment, sipping. Celeste let out a breath that could have been a laugh. That's one way to look at it. He turned to her. Her face was pale under the morning light, shadows beneath her eyes. You didn't sleep. She didn't pretend otherwise. Barely. Miles watched her a moment longer, then asked gently, You want to tell me what Langston has on you? Her grip on the mug tightened. For a moment he thought she might deflect or brush it off. Instead she just stared at the fields, then finally spoke. My father made a deal with him, she said. Years ago, before he passed. Miles' jaw tensed. What kind of deal? A bad one, she replied. Langston put up the capital for an expansion. Equipment, new land, new buildings. My father was chasing a vision, and Victor sold him a dream. But when my dad got sick, it all fell apart. Debts piled up. Langston started circling. Miles clenched his jaw. He'd seen it before. Men like Langston didn't build legacies. They waited for others to build them and then swooped in with contracts and lawyers when people were too weak to fight back. Does he have any legal claim? Miles asked. No, Celeste said, but he knows how to apply pressure. He's already pulled strings with our suppliers. Loan applications get mysteriously delayed. Contractors suddenly unavailable. He's trying to strangle us out. Miles swore under his breath. Celeste's mouth lifted in a bitter smirk. You're not the first one to say that. He looked at her, really looked, and saw it. Not just exhaustion, but the weight of trying to carry a family legacy uphill alone. And still refusing to quit. We'll figure this out, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't waver. She looked at him then, searching his face. Why do you care so much? Miles didn't blink. Because I know what it's like to lose something that matters. And I know what it feels like to have no one in your corner when you do. They didn't say anything after that. They just drank coffee and watched the mist lift off the fields. When the cups were empty, they got to work. All morning, they repaired the fence. It was slow, muddy labor, digging new post holes, hauling timber, untangling wire, but they did it without complaint. Vin joined in after breakfast, running around with Scout, handing them tools, like an over-enthusiastic foreman. Scout had developed a habit of stealing gloves and prancing around the pasture like he owned the place. Finn thought it was hilarious. Celeste didn't even try to scold him. They needed the laughter more than they needed the help. By midday, the fence stood again, not perfect, but stronger, sturdy, resilient. Celeste leaned on the top rail, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm. It's a start. Miles dusted off his hands. Next step is figuring out how to stop Langston from pushing any harder, Celeste sighed. He's got influence, money, connections. Miles watched her, then asked, "You still have friends in this town?" She hesitated. "A few." "Then we use that. Remind Windmere what this farm means." Celeste looked at him, skeptical. "And how exactly do we do that?" "We make it matter to them," he said. "We turn this place into something they can't afford to lose. A space they depend on. If Langston wants to play dirty, we answer with community." She studied him for a moment, a mix of surprise and admiration flickering in her expression. "You've thought about this?" Miles shrugged. "Building things is what I do. I don't stop just because the blueprints change." For the first time all day, Celeste smiled, real and wide, and just a little stunned. That evening, as the last light faded, she surprised him again, this time with dinner. Not leftovers or something quick, but a full meal, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, flaky biscuits fresh out of the oven, the kind of meal that felt like it belonged in the middle of something permanent. Miles blinked as she set a plate in front of him. "I figured you earned something decent," she said. Finn, already halfway through his serving, mumbled through, "A mouthful of food. Miss Celeste should cook for us every night." Miles laughed. "Finn!" Celeste just shook her head, smiling, and in that small moment, surrounded by food, laughter, and warmth that wasn't borrowed or temporary, Miles Braxton realized something. This wasn't just about saving a farm anymore. It was about building something worth staying for. The days that followed unfolded like a quiet revolution. Windmere, once a blur of routines and passing faces, began to stir with purpose. Word had gotten around about Victor Langston, about the pressure, about Celeste Whitaker's refusal to sell the land her family had built with their bare hands. People in town started paying attention. It began with small things, a neighbor dropping off extra tools, someone from the diner offering to bring lunch out to the farm. Then more, locals showing up to help fix fences, sweep out the barn, trim back overgrown paths. Folks who hadn't stepped foot on the Whitaker land in years came walking up the drive with their sleeves rolled and voices low, saying things like, "It's about time someone stood up to Langston." Miles watched it all unfold from the sidelines, Celeste moving among them with cautious gratitude, still not entirely sure how to let people help. She'd spent so many years doing everything alone. It was like she didn't know what to do with support when it showed up unannounced. One afternoon, as the last volunteers packed up their trucks, Celeste and Miles sat on the porch. A warm breeze stirred through the tall grass, carrying with it the smell of earth and sunlight. "They came," Celeste said quietly, more to herself than to him. Miles handed her a glass of sweet tea. "They didn't forget what this place means," she looked at him. "I almost lost it." "But you didn't." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, like the air before a harvest. Then softly, "Why do you care so much, Miles? About me? About this?" He didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees, his eyes scanning the fields. "I've been running for a long time," he said. "From city to city. One job to the next. Never stuck around long enough to make anything feel like mine." Celeste watched him, waiting. "But here," he said, nodding toward the land, toward the old barn, the porch beneath them, the boy and the dog racing through the yard like it was the only world that existed. It feels different, she swallowed. Different how? Miles met her gaze. Like maybe I found something I don't want to walk away from. The words hung between them, more intimate than anything he could have planned. And for once, Celeste didn't build a wall around them. She didn't change the subject or deflect with dry humor. She just let them sit. "I don't want you to leave either," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It landed between them like a door swinging open. The next morning, that fragile sense of calm was shattered. Miles recognized the sleek black car the moment it pulled up the driveway. Langston stepped out, straightening his suit cuffs like he was arriving at a board meeting, not walking onto the land he'd tried to steal. Celeste joined Miles at the edge of the porch. She stood straight, chin lifted, hands steady, but her eyes burned. Langston offered a cold smile. "You've been busy. If you're here to pitch again, don't waste your breath," she said. Langston's gaze flicked to Miles. "I see you've made allies." Miles didn't flinch. "We're done here," Langston tisked. "I was hoping we could settle this quietly, but if you want to put on a show—" He gestured toward the barn, the freshly mended fences, the people milling around the fields. "You really think this little fairy tale changes anything? I've got the county listening. Eminent domain is on the table. And when that happens, no amount of biscuits or picket signs will stop it." Celeste stepped forward. "You've always underestimated this town. That's your mistake." Langston held her stare for a long moment, then turned on his heel. "We'll be in touch." The tension didn't leave with him. It stuck in the air, in the silence he left behind. Back inside, Celeste let out a shaky breath. What if he's not bluffing? Miles looked at her. "Then we fight harder." She stared at him, eyes locked. And in that moment she didn't just believe in the fight. She believed in him. Later that day, she took his hand for the first time, not as a thank you, not as an accident, but as a choice. Fingers laced, warm and sure. Victor Langston would never understand the power of that. But out here, under the weight of legacy and the stretch of sky, that kind of connection was stronger than any threat, and for the first time in a long time, Celeste Whitaker knew she wasn't fighting alone. By the time dawn crept across the hills of Windermere the next day, the Whitaker farm was already awake. Celeste hadn't slept. Not really. The weight of Langston's visit lingered like the smell of smoke after a fire, subtle but impossible to ignore. She moved through her morning chores on instinct, coffee in hand, checking the barn, the gates, the newly repaired fence line. From the kitchen window she spotted Miles Braxton already outside, sleeves rolled, tightening bolts on the main gate, like he belonged there. Maybe he did. When she finally stepped out onto the porch, he glanced up with a grin. "You're late." "I bring the coffee," she said, holding up 2 mugs. "Then you're forgiven." She handed him a cup and leaned against the fence beside him. The breeze was cooler today. The clouds overhead moved low and fast, but for now, the weather was holding. "You got any miracle solutions for dealing with Langston?" she asked. Miles shook his head. "Not miracles, strategy." Celeste folded her arms. "Let's hear it." He sipped his coffee before speaking. "Langston's banking on pressure, on isolation. If he can make you feel like no one's got your back, he thinks you'll fold." She glanced sideways. And he's wrong." Celeste didn't respond right away. "We've rallied people," she said. "What else can we do?" Miles set his mug on a fence post and turned to face her fully. "We go bigger. Make this place too valuable to lose, not just to you, but to the entire town." Her brow rose. "You're suggesting I open a theme park?" He smirked. "Close. A market. Weekly, maybe bi-weekly. Bring in local vendors, artisans, farmers. Turn this land into something the town depends on. Not just nostalgia, but function. Community." Celeste blinked. She hadn't expected him to come with a plan already thought out. She especially hadn't expected it to be good. "You really thought this through," she said. He shrugged. "This land already means something. We just need to remind people how much." Before she could respond, the sound of a truck rolling up the driveway broke the quiet. Dust rose in its wake, and a familiar shape stepped out of the cab. Henry Warner. Celeste tensed. Henry had always been neutral, a respected landowner in Windermere with deep roots and deeper caution. If he was here, it wasn't casual. "Henry," she said as he approached. "What brings you out?" He nodded toward her, then Miles. "Langston's been talking quietly, whispering in the ears of the county board." Miles stepped forward. "What kind of whispers?" "Development plans, road expansion, infrastructure. He's laying groundwork to make a case for eminent domain." Celeste's stomach dropped. Henry nodded grimly. "If he convinces them this land's underused, they can take it. Doesn't matter how long your family's been here." Miles looked at Celeste. She looked like the air had gone out of her lungs. "How long do we have?" he asked. "A few weeks, maybe less." Henry hesitated. "This won't be easy, but it's not impossible. If you can prove this farm is vital to the community, if you can rally support fast, get signatures, press coverage, town board backing, Langston's leverage crumbles." He gave Celeste a meaningful look. "But you'll need to move, now." As Henry pulled away, silence fell between them. Celeste pressed her fingers to her temple. "It's too fast." Miles touched her arm. "It's not impossible." She looked at him, the fear still there, but something else behind it. Resolve. "That market idea of yours?" He nodded. "We start this weekend." That night, after Noah had gone to bed and Scout was snoring under the table, Celeste found Miles on the porch again. His gaze turned toward the dark stretch of land that had become something more than just soil and fences. She joined him without a word, arms crossed against the chill. "Do you really think this will work?" she asked. Miles didn't look at her at first, just nodded slowly. "I think it has to." She turned to him. "You never told me what brought you here. Why Windermere? Why this farm?" He was quiet for a long time. "My wife died," he said finally. 3 years ago. One of those freak highway accidents you read about and don't think twice. I was supposed to meet her for lunch. I was late." Celeste closed her eyes, her breath catching. "I left everything after that," he continued. "The company, the city, the apartment. I couldn't breathe in any of it. Noah barely remembers her, but I do. Every day." She reached for his hand. He let her. "I came to Windermere because I needed quiet," he said. "But I stayed because of you." Celeste didn't pull away. Not this time. Instead, she laced her fingers with his. And for the first time since her father passed, she let someone else carry a piece of the weight. By midday Saturday, the Whitaker farm didn't look like a place under threat. It looked like the center of something alive. Pop-up tents lined the open fields. Tables were filled with fresh produce, homemade candles, jars of preserves, hand-carved toys, and patchwork quilts. Kids ran through the tall grass with paper pinwheels. Laughter floated in the air like music. The smell of cinnamon, baked bread, and wood smoke drifted across the breeze. Celeste stood near the barn, stunned. She'd expected a handful of vendors, maybe a few families. What she got was the entire town of Windermere showing up with baskets under their arms and stories on their lips. She wasn't the only one who noticed. Miles moved through the crowd like he'd been there forever, shaking hands, helping an older woman unload crates of apples, nodding to the local pastor who offered space in next week's bulletin to support the farm's fight. Every step Miles took wove him deeper into this place, into her world. People remembered now. They remembered the summer festivals her father used to host in the fields. The corn mazes, the cookouts, the way this land had always been more than just acreage. It had been part of the town's heart. Celeste had almost forgotten it herself. Miles joined her at the edge of the main path, his shirt sleeves rolled, sunglasses tucked into his front pocket. He handed her a lemonade. "You built this," he said. She shook her head. "No, this is because of you." He raised a brow. I didn't grow that sourdough over there. She laughed quietly. That's Mabel Green's recipe, untouchable. Miles leaned in, voice softer now. You gave them something to believe in again, Celeste. She looked out across the crowd. Old neighbors she hadn't seen in years, teens helping set up tents. People who used to avoid her after her father's death, now stopping to hug her like time had never passed. I almost lost all this, she whispered. But you didn't, Miles said, and his hand found hers. Then a sleek black car pulled into the gravel lot. It didn't belong. Even before the dust had settled, the energy shifted. Miles straightened. Celeste's jaw tensed. Victor Langston stepped out, suit flawless, expression unreadable. He looked around at the crowd with something close to amusement. Well, he said as he strolled forward, looks like you've been busy. Celeste didn't flinch. If you came here to make another offer, don't bother. Langston's gaze swept the vendors, the people, the fences mended and the barn newly painted. Let me guess, he said. A little lemonade stand revolution? Homemade? Jam as political protest? Miles took a step forward. We're done with you, Langston, Victor smirked. You think this changes anything? I've already spoken with the county. The eminent domain request is filed. Once the review starts, all this... He waved at the market, the people. It doesn't matter. Celeste didn't move. You don't get to rewrite the rules just because you want to win. Langston leaned in, his smile tightening. You're clinging to a memory, Celeste. Farms like this are fossils. You think this is some kind of legacy? This is just sentiment. Miles' voice cut in sharp. You're wrong. Langston turned to him. Ah, yes, the millionaire with a hammer. I hope you're enjoying your fantasy, because reality's coming fast. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his shoes crunching gravel as he climbed back into his car and disappeared down the road. The silence that followed was heavier than it should have been. Around them, the market carried on. But the chill in the air had returned. Celeste exhaled slowly. He filed it, the eminent domain petition. Miles took her hand again. Then we fight it. Her eyes met his. And if we lose? Then we go down swinging. Together. Something in her chest tightened. Pain and courage all tangled up, but she didn't look away, because the way he said it made her believe him. The sun rose the next morning, casting long amber shadows across the Whitaker farm, painting everything in soft, golden light. But Celeste didn't feel the warmth. She stood alone near the old fence line, arms crossed, watching the dew evaporate off the tall grass. The market had been a success, more than she could have dreamed, but Langston's threat hung over her like a cloud that refused to break. The petition was real. The county review board was meeting in 2 weeks. Eminent domain was officially in motion, and even with the whole town behind her, it didn't feel like enough. Footsteps approached behind her. She didn't turn. Didn't expect you to be up. Before me, Miles said, voice soft. Celeste gave him a faint smile. Couldn't sleep. He stood beside her for a moment, saying nothing, just looking at the same land she was. Only she wondered if he saw it the same way. Finally, she spoke. I've spent so long fighting to hold on to this place. I didn't think I'd have to prove it was mine. Miles didn't try to comfort her with empty words. Instead, he nodded. You don't have to prove it to anyone who matters. She turned to face him. I just don't want to lose everything. You won't. You can't know that. No, he said, but I can stand next to you while we make damn sure it doesn't happen. The words settled deep, steady, certain, and Celeste realized something. This wasn't about the land anymore, not just. It was about the life she was building here, the one she hadn't even dared to hope for until recently. Later that morning, Miles and Celeste gathered the team. The friends, neighbors, volunteers who'd been showing up every day without asking why. They laid out a plan, gather signatures, organize a town meeting, present evidence to the county board that the farm was more than land. It was community infrastructure. It wasn't just saving soil and fences. It was preserving culture, memory, identity. Miles brought in an old friend from his business world, a policy consultant who knew how to navigate bureaucratic land grabs. Celeste worked day and night compiling documents, historical records, photos, letters of support. They moved fast because they had to. Windermere responded faster. Local teachers offered to host farm field trips. The town bakery launched a Save the Farm menu, donating proceeds. Even the high school students, kids Celeste had once watched grow up from a distance, offered to run a digital campaign. They shot drone footage, edited a video that went viral in the region, showing the heart of the farm through slow pans, laughter, hard work, and Celeste's voice narrating over images of her parents, Miles and Noah, working the barn, Scout chasing shadows. By the end of the week, the county board had received hundreds of messages, testimonies, press calls. The tide was shifting, and in the middle of it all, something between Miles and Celeste bloomed quietly, rooted in shared purpose, late-night porch talks, and the kind of honesty neither of them had been brave enough to want until now. One evening, as the sky faded to soft purple and Noah ran barefoot through the yard chasing fireflies, Celeste sat beside Miles on the porch, sipping tea, exhausted but full. He looked over at her, his gaze steady. "You've done something incredible here." She shook her head. "We've done it," he smiled. "You know, I wasn't planning on staying, I figured, but I've never had a reason to before." Celeste turned toward him slowly. "And now?" Miles didn't answer with words. He leaned in gently, his hand brushing hers, eyes asking a question she didn't need time to answer. When she kissed him, it wasn't dramatic or urgent. It was steady, certain, like exhaling after holding your breath for years. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. "I don't know how this ends," she whispered. "Maybe for once," he murmured. "It doesn't have to." The days that followed moved in a blur of motion and momentum. The farm had become a living organism, busy, buzzing, growing louder with every new voice added to the cause. What had once been a quiet patch of land on the outskirts of Windermere was now the heart of something louder, bigger, undeniable, and it wasn't just about saving the Whitaker farm anymore. It had become a fight for principle, for legacy, for the kind of place people didn't want to see paved over for another soulless development. Celeste could feel it in her bones. Every morning she woke up, how everything was shifting. Not just the land, but her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building again. Miles was always there, hammer in hand, blueprints in his back pocket, and that steady gaze that never made her feel small. He moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made people listen, and he worked like he had something to prove to himself, not anyone else. He never missed a sunrise. He never once talked about leaving. One evening, after a long day of reinforcing, the eastern fencing with volunteers, they stood on the porch watching the last slivers of light disappear behind the trees. Noah and Scout were already asleep inside, and the farm was wrapped in a silence that felt earned. Celeste leaned against the railing, barefoot, holding a glass of wine she hadn't touched. "I forgot what it was like," she said quietly. Miles glanced at her. "What?" "To not feel like I'm doing everything alone." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned to face him, searching his face. "You think we can really stop him?" Miles nodded. "Langston underestimated this town, and he definitely underestimated you." She gave a dry smile. "He won't make that mistake again." Just then, headlights flickered in the distance, bouncing off the gravel road like a warning bell. Another car. But this one was different. It was older, dust-covered, and familiar. As it pulled up, Celeste narrowed her eyes. The driver stepped out, a woman in her 60s, sun-lined skin, sharp eyes, and a no-nonsense stride. She wore a denim jacket and work boots, and carried herself like someone who hadn't let age slow her down. Celeste blinked. "Is that—" "Mabel Green," Miles confirmed, stepping forward with a grin. "Queen of Winmere pie contests and rumour mills." Mabel strode up the porch steps without waiting for permission. "I brought a pecan pie and a warning," she said, thrusting a dish into Celeste's hands. Celeste blinked. "That's a hell of a greeting." "I don't waste time with small talk," Mabel said, hands on hips. "Langston's twisting arms again. I heard from my niece on the zoning board. He's trying to push the review through early. End of this week." Celeste's breath hitched. "This week?" Mabel nodded. "He's getting nervous. That video you posted, it's getting attention from regional news. A county doesn't like bad press." Miles leaned against the railing. "So we have to move faster." "No," Mabel said. "You have to finish strong. You've got the town. You've got the evidence. Now you need to make them feel it." Celeste looked at her. "How?" Mabel's grin was sharp. "You throw one hell of a final market. Pull everyone in. Food, music, booths, kids' tours. Make it undeniable. Make it emotional. Make it impossible for the board to vote against you without looking like villains." She turned to go, then paused. "And for the love of God, someone brings cider. No one says no to cider." She left as quickly as she came, dust swirling in her wake. Celeste stared after her, pie dish still in hand. Miles chuckled. "I like her. She terrifies me," Celeste replied, but her mind was already spinning. They had 4 days to turn a movement into something unforgettable. She looked at Miles. "We can do this, right?" He stepped closer. "You're not doing it alone." And just like that, the last flicker of doubt fell away. It was time to show Langston, the county, and anyone else watching that this land wasn't just dirt. It was home. The final market day came like thunder, fast, loud, and impossible to ignore. By sunrise, the Whitaker farm was already alive. Dozens of volunteers moved with purpose, setting up tents and booths with practiced ease. Strings of lights were draped across the trees, hay bales arranged in circles for seating, tables stacked with baked goods, handmade crafts, jars of honey and pickles, wooden toys, candles, flower arrangements. Every part of Winmere had shown up. Even the town's high school band was setting up on the far edge of the field, tuning instruments, stretching chords, cracking jokes over steaming coffee. Celeste stood near the barn, clipboard in hand, trying to maintain order while her chest thudded with nerves. Miles appeared beside her, holding 2 travel mugs of black coffee like some kind of divine intervention. "You've got 2 minutes to pretend you're calm," he said, handing her a cup. Celeste smirked. "What happens after that?" "Then you get to panic." She took a deep breath. "If this doesn't work—" "It will," he cut in firm, "because you've already done the part Langston never understood. You gave people something to believe in. That's harder to kill than permits and paperwork." His confidence anchored her. Noah came running up a second later, Scout bounding behind him in a blur of fur and energy. "Miss Celeste, there's already people in line for the cider." Celeste glanced toward the road and nearly choked. Dozens of cars, people walking in groups, holding hands, pushing strollers. Not just from Winmere either. She saw unfamiliar faces, folks who must have driven in after seeing the campaign video. The town hadn't just come through, they'd multiplied. The day unfolded in waves. Food vendors sold out by mid-afternoon. Kids ran hay bale obstacle courses. Celeste led walking tours of the property every hour, telling stories of her parents, showing photos of what the farm had looked like 50 years ago. People cried. People clapped. Mabel Green stationed herself near the cider booth like a general watching her troops. By late afternoon, a group of county officials arrived. Miles spotted them immediately. Blazers, clipboards, polite smiles that didn't quite hide their scrutiny. Celeste straightened the second she saw them. "You ready for this?" Miles asked. "No," she replied, "but I'm doing it anyway." She walked them through the market, guided, engaged, measured. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She simply showed them what the farm had become. "This isn't nostalgia," she told them near the end. "It's function. This land feeds people, employs people, brings people together. You take this away, you're not just destroying acreage, you're severing roots. The head official, a graying man with kind eyes, nodded slowly. We've received more community testimony in the last week than in any zoning case we've reviewed in 5 years. Celeste nodded. That's because this matters. When they left, no promises were made, but she saw it in their faces. Hesitation and hope. As the sky shifted to twilight, Miles found her again, this time near the back pasture, alone, away from the hum of voices and laughter. He stood beside her without saying anything at first. "You were incredible today," he finally said. Celeste gave a small laugh. "I was sweaty and terrified. Still incredible." They stood there watching the sun dip low, turning the fields to fire. Everything they'd done, everything they'd built, had led to this. "I didn't think I had anything left to fight with," she whispered. "Not really." "You didn't. Need more strength," Miles said. "You just needed to know someone would stand next to you when you used it." She looked at him, the wind pulling strands of her hair across her face. "I used to think letting someone in meant losing control," she said. "Now I think maybe it means not losing everything else." He reached for her hand, and this time, when she laced her fingers through his, there was no hesitation at all. 2 days later, the official decision came. Celeste stood on the farmhouse porch, letter in hand, hands trembling, heart beating in a rhythm she couldn't control. The envelope was unassuming, just white paper, black text, county seal in the corner, but it felt heavier than any storm cloud that had ever rolled over her land. Miles stood nearby, one hand resting on the porch railing, the other wrapped tightly. Around a coffee mug he hadn't touched. Noah watched silently from the steps, Scout curled beside him as if he knew something important was about to happen. Celeste took a breath and opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the first paragraph. Then the second, then everything blurred. "Well?" Miles asked, unable to wait any longer. She looked up, blinking fast, her voice caught in her throat. "They denied Langston's petition," she whispered. Miles stepped closer, heart thudding. "They ruled in our favor," she continued, still in shock. "The farm is officially protected. They acknowledged the market, the educational programming, the community support. It's safe." Miles let out a breath like he'd been holding it for years. Noah whooped and jumped up, running to wrap his arms around Celeste's waist. Scout barked in celebration, chasing his own tail with excitement. Celeste laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in what felt like a decade. She hugged her son, buried her face in his messy hair, then looked at Miles with disbelief. "We did it," she said. He stepped toward her, eyes locked with hers. "No," he said quietly. "You did it." She reached for his hand and pulled him into a tight, grounding embrace. For a long moment, they just stood there, breathing, holding each other in the warm glow of a win they'd fought tooth and nail for. The news spread fast. By midday, half the town had shown up, not for a protest this time, but for a celebration. Someone brought fireworks. Someone else set up speakers and music. The bakery delivered 5 pies without being asked. Mabel Green showed up in a sun hat and a Save the Farm t-shirt, wielding a tray of cider like it was champagne. People danced in the fields, kids ran through the orchard, and Celeste watched it all with a full heart, knowing what had almost been lost and what had bloomed in its place. Later, as the sun began to set and the music faded into the hum of crickets, Miles found her leaning against the barn, arms folded, eyes turned to the horizon. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms gently around her waist. She leaned into him instantly. "It's really over," she said softly. "It's just beginning," he corrected. She turned her head slightly, a half-smile tugging at her lips. "So, what now?" "Miles," rested his chin on her shoulder. Now we breathe, we build, we plant something new. Celeste looked back at the house, the porch light glowing, Noah's laughter echoing from inside, and then out at the fields that had held her grief, her fear, and now, her hope. She turned to Miles fully, cupped his face in her hands, and kissed him like she meant it, because she did, and when they broke apart, she whispered, "You're not leaving, are you?" He shook his head. "No, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The wind rustled through the trees, the stars blinked awake, one by one, and for the first time in years, Celeste Whittaker felt not only at peace, but whole. The farm settled into its new rhythm, like it had been waiting for this version of itself all along. The weekly market became more than a reaction. It became a tradition. Locals and out-of-towners kept showing up, some for the produce, others for the story. The barn, once a forgotten relic, now stood proud with fresh paint, repaired beams, and a new sign over its entrance: Whittaker Commons. It was no longer just a farm. It was a place where people gathered, where something that almost died had been brought back to life, stronger, fuller, more rooted. Noah became the unofficial tour guide, showing kids how to plant seeds in the new garden beds, explaining the difference between sweet corn and field corn like a seasoned pro. Scout, naturally, appointed himself as security detail, making sure every visitor got at least one paw print on their jeans before leaving. Miles didn't just stay, he invested. He worked the land like it had always been his, hosted workshops in the barn for locals wanting to learn about carpentry, and began laying out plans for a greenhouse and an outdoor education center. Not as a businessman chasing ROI, but as a man who had finally found where he belonged. One afternoon, as summer edged its way into fall, Noah came racing across the field, his cheeks flushed, eyes wide. "The flowers!" he shouted, grabbing Celeste's hand. "Come see!" She let him pull her along, laughing, not knowing what to expect, until they reached the small patch of earth near the back of the garden, where weeks ago she and Noah had knelt side by side, burying tiny seeds in dry dirt. Now it was alive, brilliant. Wildflowers had pushed through the soil in every direction, reds, yellows, blues swaying in the breeze like a chorus of hope. Miles joined them, wrapping an arm around Celeste's waist, looking down at the bloom of color. "They made it," Noah said proudly. Celeste crouched beside him, brushing her fingers gently across a soft purple petal. "You said they would," she whispered. Noah grinned. "Miss Celeste said you just have to believe in what you can't see yet." Miles watched them both, heart full, the weight he'd carried for years, finally replaced with something lighter. "I think we planted more than just flowers that day," he said quietly. Celeste looked up at him. "Yes, I think we did." They stood together in the middle of what almost never was. This unlikely love, this reborn land, this life neither of them expected. And it felt sacred, not perfect, but real, earned, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Celeste. Whittaker wasn't bracing for the next blow. She was reaching for what came next, with her feet on solid ground and someone at her side who knew how to stay. The wind moved through the field like a whisper of promise. The barn stood tall behind them, and beneath their feet, new roots dug. Indeep, what did you think of this story? Where are you watching from? Drop us a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. If this story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever lost someone or found love where you least expected, then don't just scroll away. Subscribe to the channel. Like this video if your heart felt anything, and share it with someone who still believes that healing is possible. No matter how broken the past may seem, because stories like this, they aren't just fiction, they're reminders of what truly matters.